Alrighty, I assume the music is off and therefore I should start, even though the clock on the back of the wall behind me is actually not even at 20 past. So if you're worried about time, don't look at the back of that clock because it's wrong. How's everyone feeling this morning? Good? Yay! Who's got some coffee, tea? You're all caffeinated. Everyone's good. We had a fantastic talk this morning about why we shouldn't build platforms, so that's fun. And today we're going to be talking about Git, GitHub, and gaming. So we'll talk a little bit about Git, a little bit about GitHub, and then about gaming. So where are all my gamers in the room? A few people, what are we playing lately? Tears of the Kingdom, Baldur's Gate 3. I'd say Starfield, but if I assume you're playing Starfield, you're actually not here right now because it just released about 5 hours ago. Anyone hanging out for Starfield though? Yeah, cool. All right, where are my game devs at? We've got some game developers in the room. Some aspiring game developers maybe? Awesome. So we'll be covering a bunch of this stuff today. So I am Mish Manners. I am from GitHub. I understand that my colleague April gave a talk yesterday and gave out all the shirts that looked exactly like this. And so I didn't grab one of those shirts yesterday. I do work for GitHub, so shout out to all the fans though who were wearing these shirts yesterday and just looked like we had an army of GitHub people in the room. It was fantastic. So I work at GitHub. I'm on the developer relations team as a developer advocate. That's our wonderful GitHub advocate, and I think I have some of those stickers left, so if you'd like some, you can come chat to me afterwards. GitHub is on every social media platform known to man, even TikTok, and we do have a Twitch stream. No, we don't stream video gaming on the GitHub Twitch channel. We stream live coding, talking to maintainers, developers, and more, so go and follow us on those channels, and there's my socials there as well. Now, I'd say I'm actually really torn with this logo, with this slide as to whether I should actually change the Twitter logo or not. I think I'm just going to leave it though, so feel free to tweet during the talk. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover a few things. This is going to be a little bit of an intro to Git, because I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. We know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about Git and source control. A little bit about collaboration. It's one of my favorite topics. Some of GitHub's non-code features. Now, we know lots of you here probably use. Everyone got a GitHub account in the room? Yeah, pretty much. Awesome. I'm going to talk about some of the features that you may or may not know about. Every time I talk about these, I always have developers come up to me and go, wow, these are so cool. I had no idea we had these. So I'll talk about some of those. Talk about source control and gaming. So some of the issues, challenges, and maybe what we can do next. Talk about open source game engines that you might be able to use to develop your own games as well. And then how to get involved in gaming. I always have lots of people come up to me, how to get involved in game development, esports and all that kind of thing. We're not going to talk about how to get involved as a professional player, although the Mario Kart tournament was last night. We're going to talk about how to get involved in game development. So first of all, Git. Everyone know what Git is in the room? So I can breeze through this pretty quickly. Awesome. Distributed version control system. We know that means it is a version control system where everyone has access to the same history as everyone else, which makes it really easy to collaborate on. So if we have a file here, we've got some history tracking. This would be if I was working on a file by myself, I might create the document, make some changes, make some grammar fixes, maybe change the color. Feature changes, maybe change a logo. Now, the great thing about history tracking is that I can obviously go back to one of these versions if I need to. The old version of history tracking looked like something like this, and I saw a tweet about Scott Hanselman's keynote the other day. I think it was Amy mentioned. I'm surprised and upset that there wasn't a PowerPoint version final-_1 version 3.5.7 final. But this is what we used to do for source control. Does everyone kind of remember this back in the 90s? Yep, a few people. This is what the source control looked like back then. And what the problem with this is, obviously, the first problem is that that's going to take up a lot more space than if I just had one file. Second problem is that it is really difficult to change between these. How many times have you gone, oh, which one am I actually using? Or I really like the colors and styles in that old version that I was using. I want to put it into this new version. So how do I do that? There's a problem there. Now, if we look at, that's not very good. Now, what happens if we actually start using this with other people? So this is what it looks like by myself. Now, if I start introducing other people into the mix, who's actually worked on group projects here? Pretty much everyone in the room, right? Yeah, I don't know if this is a thing like outside of Australia, but in Australia, when you did university and you saw a university subject that you may or may not want to do, you'd look at it and go, oh, not going to do that one. That's got a group project in it. not going to do that course. So I don't know if that's a thing just in Australia, but a lot of people try and shy away from group projects because of things like this. So if you've worked on a project before, you may have come up against something like this. Everyone seen this as well? Yeah. Again, which one is actually the final one? How do we merge all these changes? How do I get Mark's and Dave's and Carly's suggestions all into the same thing? What if we, change some colors? What if we move things together? How do we actually combine all those? Obviously, that's another problem here. Now, some people like to think of it as, track changes in a document. We kind of have a little bit of version control happening in things like Google now, which is actually really good. But what this actually happens is, with this distributed version control system, is we don't just have the same file on, available to me. We now put it on a cloud system. We now have the same lot of, changes and information all saved and available to all of us. So the great thing about Git is that all this information is condensed down to one file, and all that history is saved into a Git, which is great. And everyone's happy. Yay. So now you all know what Git is if you didn't already know it, but it looks like most of you know it, which is great. Now, why does this actually matter? Why does Git matter? And why does being able to have a distributed version control system matter? It matters because of this little thing called collaboration. Now, I said this is something I really enjoy doing. Who actually works in a team here? Yeah, pretty much everyone. Who doesn't like, you have those like moments where you're like, oh, I just don't want to work with that person because they just don't give me what I need. And, working with this person is really good because, we work really well together. Collaboration is really, really important for getting things done. We are much more effective and efficient if we can collaborate effectively and work on a project to actually deliver something. Not only is it effective and efficient because we actually deliver things better and on time, we deliver better products to our customers and users because we're actually taking into account a diverse range of opinions. It's not just me building the thing now, it's me and Amy and Damo and Scott and everyone in this room now is all building a thing that I just made up. But collaboration is really important for this reason. It's also not something that is new. Some people look at this thing, because collaboration is a pillar of DevOps, one of the 4 pillars of DevOps. A lot of people go, oh, this must be a new thing then. This new thing called collaboration is part of DevOps, it's part of the culture. It's like, well, it's nothing really new. We just tend to talk about it a lot now because I feel like it's something that not everyone does really well. Good companies do this really well. So collaboration is really important for those reasons. This is something our old CEO, Nat, used to say. Everyone achieves more if we actually work together. And he also used to say, like, coding is a team sport. I think that was one of his best quotes. Coding is a team sport. We need to all work on this together. And famously at GitHub, Mike Hanley, the head of security at GitHub, he always says, all right, put your hand up if you're on a security team. That should be everyone. So collaborating, working together, coding together is really important. We achieve a lot more. So what do I mean by this? Now, this is something I like to do because I've worked a lot in... Who's done a hackathon here? Yeah, this is something I like to talk about hackathons because some people go like, oh, but I just want to come to a hackathon and just like work by myself and not really do anything with other people. Or I want to come to a hackathon and I just want to build this cool thing. I don't really care about what problem we're solving and that kind of thing. So what happens when we don't have really good collaboration? So here's 4 teams, say for all intensive purposes of today. We've got an engineering team, we've got maybe a social media team, we've got a sales team, maybe a management team. If all these teams are working independently of one another, no one really knows what the other team is doing. So, and you've probably worked in companies where this is probably going to resonate with you right now. The sales team is out there selling something that is not the thing that the engineering team is doing. The community team is getting feedback from the users, which is not going back to the customers. And the management team is sitting somewhere in the middle going, what the heck is going on? Why are people not buying our product? But also, why are the sales team selling something that doesn't actually exist right now yet? They're selling something 5 years in the future and all our users are going, wow, where's this thing you promised me? That's what happens when we don't have good collaboration and we don't talk to one another. Now, for simplicity, I just put a cross here to connect a couple of teams, but really all these teams should be connected, right? Now, if all these teams are connected, collaboration happens much better. We're actually selling the products that we're building. We're receiving feedback from our customers. We're implementing that into our product. The management team is happy because, our sales have gone through the roof and we're actually building something that people are actually using. That sounds really good. Now, because of the way our communities and our companies work, we often have a lot of technology that sits within the middle here to help facilitate this collaboration. Slack, Teams, Discord, whatever it happens to be. Now, because I work at GitHub, I'm going to talk about a couple of the GitHub features that we have for collaboration. I'm not going to go into heaps of these because a lot of you already know some of these, but there's a couple that I wanted to point out. So GitHub platform, there's over 100 million developers on the platform. Who doesn't have a GitHub account? You don't have to shame. Oh, well, you can come and see us afterwards. We still love you. It's great. So GitHub is a platform where developers come together to build code together, to collaborate together. So yes, it's a place to store your code and house the Git repository that we just talked about at the start, that version control system, but it's much more than that. Now, GitHub has a whole bunch of features that are really, really great for collaborating. Now, some of you will know some of these. Code review is a very obvious one. There's teams where you can actually manage the people who are within your organization, who can actually see the code that you're working on. We've got issues and forms, which I'll talk a little bit about forms, because it's a bit more newer feature we've got. Projects, something I will talk about because it's a personal favorite, and it's also something that a lot of developers don't actually know about. And it's a really, really great way of collaborating, not just within your development team, but with your entire organization. Documentation, really important. One thing I love about GitHub is we have documentation living alongside our code. We have discussions, which is something I'll talk about really briefly because, again, bit newer feature, not everyone knows about it. And then this whole idea of social coding. So let's jump into just a couple of these things here. So the first one is issue forms. So who has set up or done a project where you submit an issue and it actually isn't an issue? It actually ends up being, and it's really annoying, the new PowerPoint feature doesn't allow me to pause these videos anymore. But the issue you originally submitted isn't actually an issue. So the idea of issues, I'm just going to go back just so we can stop that playing. So originally, issues were designed so that you submitted an issue. There is a bug in the code, or there is a feature I want to request, or there's this thing I found that needs to be fixed. It was an issue. Now, what we've found with issues over time is issues have become this thing of like, hey, have you thought about maybe doing this? Or maybe we should do like a showcase right now. Maybe we should all talk about the cool things. Who's actually been in a repository where issues aren't really issues? Yeah, quite a number of you, right? The other thing that's the problem with issues, and that's where we'll come back to the discussions, but the other thing with issues, who's like made issue templates before? Lots of people? Yep. You make a template, or who's actually, you probably more so filled out a template. I would like you to submit a bug report. Here is the template that I've provided you. Please submit me, what are you experiencing? What is it experiencing on which platform? Give me the errors, give me screenshots, give me things. Give me all this information, basically. Those issue templates were designed to collect the information that you want, right? Who manages a repository here? Anyone? Have you ever received a bug report where you're like, they literally just said, I found a bug and there's nothing else? Yeah. Now the problem with that is in those issue templates is there's no required fields. I can submit a blank issue if I really want to. So if I have a look here, these issues forms here. So, if I can turn on issue forms by going into my repository settings here and setting up a template to build a form. So here's a little form that I've got here. And this is just a generic standard issue template. Now, if I go and update that, I can actually go in and now I've got a template. Now, all I can do, literally I can delete the whole thing and just put nothing and submit that if I really wanted to, right? The better thing you can do now is issue forms. So YAML files, yay, everyone loves YAML. You can use a YAML file to create like a HTML-like form, like a Google form, with required fields. So that now when you get a bug report, nobody can click the submit button until all the things are filled out, right? So you can create these for all different things. You can create them for your feature requests and things like that. And I love these issue forms. They're really great. The next one is project management. So I recently moved house and I use GitHub projects to move my house. I've got a whole talk coming on this, by the way. But this was really fun. So it's a Kanban style project board where I can just add all the things that I want for moving my house. So I've created different tabs along the top here as well, where I've got different drilled down into. Say, for example, I had this project board with someone else, and I needed just the finance people to see how much money it needs to be spent. They could just go into the tab that I've created there and see that. I can assign different issues to this as well. So the great thing about projects is it's not necessarily specific to one repository. You can have like a project for your org and then add all different issues from all different repositories. So it's really, really great to actually be able to manage your project that way. I like this table view as well. And the timeline view is a really new feature we only released about a month ago. Now, my colleague Kadesha wrote a really great blog post on 10 things you didn't know about GitHub projects, and that's linked in the resources at the end. So GitHub projects, it's a fantastic tool that we've released. I think we're starting to call it planning and tracking because you can just do some amazing things with it. Now, I've got a much longer talk on that, but we want to get to the gaming stuff. Now, I did mention briefly, I talked about this too, which is GitHub discussions. Now, this is where you have those discussions in your issues. So, people create those issues and it's not really an issue, it ends up becoming a discussion. We're like, why don't we just have a discussion forum? So GitHub discussions is a great way to have those forum-style conversations happening right alongside your code. Now, this is the discussion repo for GitHub feedback. So any feedback you ever want to give to GitHub about a product, a feature, a service, put it in here, and I talk to the product managers of each of these products, and they read this stuff. And what's really cool about the GitHub discussions is when we release like a changelog, like a new feature, it's often linked back to a discussion where somebody requested the feature. But this is great. You can see here we can have these, all different types of discussions here. We've got all the categories along the side there. And we can have these more forum-style conversations where we don't need to close them off because we haven't completed the bug report or the feature request. So we can have all this here. I've seen some great ways that discussions have been used too, which is awesome. Now, back when GitHub was kind of first started, or maybe a little bit further into it, GitHub became known as this social coding platform for many of these reasons. It's a way for people to show off their contributions to the open source community. It's a way for people to connect and collaborate with others and work on code together. And I really like this idea of social coding. Now, this term was obviously coined in the early days of GitHub, and it is a place to not just store your repositories, but to collaborate. And that all comes down to this idea of source control here. Now, GitHub is the home of open source. It's also one of the homes of source control. Now, who's using GitHub within their companies? Yep, people using GitHub within their personal passion projects. Great. We all are probably using this in many ways. And keep your hand up if it's for a software-specific project. Pretty much everyone, right? You can use it for non-software projects. But source control is a very normal thing to use in a software development company. Has anyone ever worked at a software development company that doesn't use some sort of source control? A few people. It's horrible, right? Like, how do you know what you're doing? And how do you know what versions of stuff have been done? And how do you know, how can you go back? And when you come to the company, you're like, I don't know what you've historically done here, so I'm probably just going to make everything up on the fly because you haven't got any way for me to go back and check these things, right? So source control is very normal when it comes to software development. So why then is it not such a normal thing? So put up those hands again, the game developers in the room. Yeah, a few of them. Source control is not really a normal thing when it comes to gaming, right? Yeah, you kind of give it, yep, that's good. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to source control and gaming. And I'm going to call it out right now. We're not going to solve all these problems today. But there's a bunch of problems. Now, we know that Git and GitHub is really good for code. We know that Git works really well for doing version control on software. Because what is software? It's mostly text files, right? That's great. What are the problems when it comes to gaming? Now, there's a lot of different problems. We're going to go through a couple of them here. Now, one of the first issues, I created this game because I used GitHub for source control, and I was like, sweet, I'm going to build this Lego game that I did during COVID because I had nothing else to do, right? And so I was like, it's mostly software, right? I can totally just use GitHub to build this game. And yeah, I came up against lots of issues, lots and lots of issues. And I experienced, a lot of these while I was actually, going through building this. Now, I built this with Unity, which is one of the popular game engine choices. Obviously, Unreal as being the other popular game engine. But this was a micro game that I built, right? And you can see here, I've got the repository on GitHub. I'm using Unity, trying to do some source control on it, right? And I came up against a few issues. Some of the first issues, file types. Now, you can see here, this is my repository. If I go into this, some of the folders, I created like a little trailer video because, what's a game without a trailer? So I created a trailer video. There's an MP4 file in there. I also, if you were quick enough to catch that, I committed my Adobe Premiere Pro project into here as well. You can see there, I tried to pull up the raw file. Didn't work. GitHub says it's there, but I can't actually see it. And there's a few other things there too. There's some pretty big images. There's my Premiere profile. So when it comes to gaming, we don't just have text files. They're there. The text files are there. That's what makes the game actually work. But the thing about gaming is there's all these other assets around it that are very, very different file types. We have video files. We have images. We have lots of binary assets. We have all these different types of things, like PRV file. That's my Adobe Premiere Pro project. Yay. Now, the thing about these is GitHub is starting to support a lot of these files, right? We can see that, when I opened up that image, hey, the image shows. That's a bit of a newer thing that didn't happen before. We can even embed like MP4s if they're small enough into things like issues and discussions and all that kind of thing. So GitHub's starting to support some of these things, which is great. But it doesn't work for everything. So that's the first thing. So we know that, file types is, a bit of an interesting issue. But that's just my little game, my little micro game. Who's played something like Final Fantasy 16? It's a Final Fantasy 7 remake. When I first recorded started working on this, Final Fantasy 7 had just come out, the remake, so I was like, ooh, that's going in there. So if we have a look at something like a much bigger game, they have all these things within the game, right? They have cutscenes and cinematics and all these other things that go alongside the gameplay. Now, I didn't have these big assets in my micro game, but some of the same problems still existed. Now, if I had problems of, about large media files within my tiny little Lego micro game that I built, imagine the type of problems that Square Enix have when they try and do some sort of source control on something like Final Fantasy and having all these large assets, right? Like this. The other thing is that there's a lot of differences in the way that we do video game development. So we have designers as well. Now, something like this is part of the game design process, right? This idea of concept art. Now, this thing itself, this probably isn't going to be in the game, like this, something like this image, or even these things. That's probably not going to be in the game. Yes, Link is going to be there with this outfit in the gameplay itself, and this is Tears of the Kingdom. But that's probably not going to be there. It might show up in a loading screen, maybe. Fortnite tends to do that. Lots of their assets into loading screens. But this isn't probably going to show up. It might actually show up instead in a fan art book or something like that, or a collector's edition art book. But the interesting thing about stuff like this is this gets used within the process, right? Imagine, so say we put this into an art book and you go and buy this as part of the collector's edition. This is kind of like the source control, or like the early stage of the code, if we will, from an artist's perspective. Imagine if you bought a game concept book or whatever, or a collector's edition, and it had the early code that they've written. You're like, wow, that was cool. Look at how far the code's come. As a bit of a, not really a developer, but as a nerd, I think that's really cool, right? But stuff like this doesn't come up. So how do we do source control on assets like this when we kind of need to go back to them all the time, right? So that's another issue there. Another one, the sheer file size. This is my micro game, and this is massive, right? So this little micro game, I think I've got it on somewhere here, but like the video of the Final Fantasy 7 I just showed you was like 57 megabytes, and that's just a GIF. Or if you went to Lemon's talk yesterday, GIFs don't actually exist, so it's a it's a video. But this is a micro game, and it's still giant in terms of the file size. Now, we know that games back in the day were obviously a lot smaller. Something like Doom, I think, as Lemon said in his talk yesterday, was like 2.39 megabytes. So even a game like that, like that's still a decent chunk, right? So the sheer file size is huge. So there's that 57 megabyte. That's actually the trailer video. So the trailer that I created there, like, 5 seconds long, it's 57 megabytes. Now, if you had a code file that's that big, that's a bit crazy, right? So file size is a real problem. Now, if we kind of compare it, does anyone know the rough size of the mono repo or the monolith that actually runs Git? Yeah, obviously Damo knows. I think it was like with 11 to, I think it's actually gotten a bit bigger now. When I wrote this, it was like 11 gig on disk. 11 gig on disk. Now it's about 17. That's 17 gigabytes to run the entirety of GitHub, right? When you think about that, that's actually pretty comparable. Like, that's not really that big to run all of GitHub, right? I installed Forza Horizon 5 on my computer the other day. Do you know how big that game is? It was 175 megabytes, and that's just the game. Like, that's not the thing in the background that runs everything, right? Like, just games are just such big things that take up so much space. Even something like Age of Empires. So back when this was first released, I think it was like 80 megabytes on a computer, and it still came on a disk. Now, if you go and buy the high definition version, I think if you want to run it in like the 4K ultra high definition, it's like 248 gigabytes. Like, games are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the problems around source control and the fact that we have these giant big file sizes are just getting harder and harder and harder to manage. These files are literally just too big. So what do we do about it? Now, if you've done some game development, you're probably sitting there going, oh, but there is a thing that exists to help us with this. There's something that exists to help us to manage these large files going into Git. Now, what I'm talking about is the Git large file storage. Does anyone use this? A few people? Yeah, this is all right. I mean, it's actively being worked on, which is great. I just checked out the repository last night, and the last release of the Git large file system was July this year. So it's actively being worked on. This is it here, right? So, 5 days ago they made a commit, and obviously did the last release in July. So this is actively being worked on. This is good. It's not great. You've probably come up against some issues yourself, right? You're probably going, oh yeah, there's been some things. There's a lot of limitations to using something like this. So what it does is it basically allows you to store the file kind of elsewhere, and it kind of does like a link to it. Now, I didn't explain that very well, but it's basically got a link to where the actual file, you're not actually committing that giant file to GitHub. Now, I've been working on my website for my wedding recently, and I tried to commit some of the files to my GitHub repository, like the raw files I like working on for Photoshop, and I was like, you can't commit this. It is too big for GitHub to handle. And I was like, what? I was like, oh yeah, that's right. GitHub has file size limits. So there's some file size limits in GitHub. When I was using GitHub Desktop, it told me it was like 100 megabytes, which is, it's enough. If you're working on code, there's probably no problem. But if you're working on large files like this, big problem. Even the Git large file storage, however, has a limit. It's 5 gigabytes. Again, quite large. If you're working on code, there's going to be no issues. If you're working on something like gaming, there's going to be some problems there. Another problem is this is an interim solution. Even the people who make this stuff said, we are hoping this is an interim solution because we're hoping that Git comes up with something eventually to be able to do this stuff. This is a third-party thing that is being actively worked on by people, which is great, but it is not designed to be an end solution. So there's some issues there too. The other thing that if you start using the Git large file storage system, it is an irreversible decision. You get some issues when you start doing commits and with your history and control. You can't always go back to some of the history. So yes, it commits all your history, but it doesn't quite handle it in the right ways, and you can get some issues with it. There's also issues when using our Git large file system when cloning. So if you're trying to share this and do things, or you created a base game, you want to create like a new one, there's some issues there. And I've got a link to some of a bit more of an explanation of some of these issues. The next problem in gaming, the number of files, the sheer number of files that is required to create a game. Now, I've kind of mentioned a few of them. We have trailers, and we have artwork, and we have all the, the code files to actually run the game. But there's a whole lot of tiny, tiny files within a gaming environment that there's just so many of them, right? So let's look at a little bit of an example. So this is my Unity project that I downloaded and put on disk. We can see here, there's some files. Now, if I keep clicking into each folder, you can see there's just more and more and more files. And I was like, okay, there's a lot of files here. So let's actually see how many files are in here. Again, this is a micro game. 17,170 files in 751 folders. That is a lot of files. So you can imagine when you're trying to do push changes, there's going to be some issues, right? Git can't handle all of those things happening at once. The other thing is, as I kind of mentioned, there's just lots and lots of tiny little files in there. So there's going to be micro changes, if any, to a lot of the files. And here's some sprites. The sprites take tiny little things, take up a small amount of files. But things like, the sprites, the install files, the maps, the binary, all these things just compile some of those issues when you start trying to do version control on this giant number of files. Now again, that was with my micro game. This is a tiny little game that can run in a web browser, right? So you can imagine how many files are in something a lot bigger. So if I have a look here, this is my Elder Scrolls Online game file that I've got installed on my computer. Actually, I think I had to have it installed on this one, which is great. It can run on almost anything. But if we start looking here, there's just so many things. The XML files, there's all the language files there, there's the DLLs, there's stuff in the launcher. There's all these things happening. There's the launcher helper, because, I need help running the launcher apparently. And there's just so many things happening in here, right? So if I go back and have a look and, we do the whole right click and see how many, files are in here, probably going to come up with a lot of files, right? So this is just, these game things are just huge, right? So what's the next problem there? Okay, we've got a few problems already happening. We've got, there's the sheer number of files, we've got the size of the files, and then, we've got the type of files. They're all things that are issues with the files themselves. Are there any other issues when it comes to game development? Not that this is an issue, but we work with non-developers in gaming. We have artists, designers, and decision making. Obviously, we have this in software as well, right? We have our marketing people and our sales people and our managers and all that kind of thing. And the great thing about working at GitHub is everyone at GitHub actually uses GitHub, which is kind of cool. But when it comes to gaming, your artists and designers and things like that are actually working with assets and files that need to go in the game. They're not just out there selling the thing, they're out there creating things. Now, yes, you have this in software, you have your UX designers and things like that, but it's very different to having artists that are creating paintings and portraits, or the people working in the Weta workshops making those cool clay figures before they then sketch it and then put it into the game. Now, this, for me, isn't necessarily a problem because of the things I talked about earlier about collaboration and the fact that we are all a team. We should be collaborating together. But a lot of people see having non-developers on a team as an issue. Well, the non-developers don't know how to use GitHub, and the non-developers can't put their stuff on GitHub, and why should we be teaching them when they should just be doing their thing and doing amazing work? But I think teamwork is much more important. We should actually be collaborating together. And some of those things that I mentioned before about GitHub's non-code features are designed to bring non-developers into the team. That's why I love the projects thing so much, because you can add in your marketing people and your designers and your managers. You can add them all to the project board. Someone's like, well, I don't want to add them to the project board. They might move things around and change stuff, and then our whole roadmap and our sprint is out. Well, you can add them as viewers. They don't have to be able to change things, but having eyes on what's actually happening. Imagine your marketing team actually being able to see your roadmap and going, oh, well, we shouldn't be marketing that stuff now because their sprint's actually behind. You know, being able to collaborate in ways like this is really awesome. This is why I love, GitHub's more non-code features, which are awesome. So let's have a recap at some of the issues when it comes to source control and gaming. So we've got file types. Lots of images, lots of videos, things like that. We've got large files, big, giant files, 4K craziness. They have the 8K and the 16K stuff now, which is just going to make game files even bigger and bigger and bigger. We've got a huge, I put in quotes, that code base. We have a huge base of stuff. We have lots and lots of files happening there. We also have too many files. I don't want to say too many. It's not like we're saying, oh, we could actually get rid of half these files. No, the game's not going to work if you get rid of half the files. But this sheer number of files is an issue to deal with when you're trying to do source control. We have non-developers, and as I put it there in bracket, that really shouldn't be an issue. That's more of a cultural issue as opposed to a technical issue, which is why I like talking about, the collaboration pillar of DevOps. When they say DevOps is as much about a cultural change as it is about tools and technology use. So it's about that. So despite a lot of these issues we're seeing in source control, people say to me, well, okay, does any game companies even use GitHub at all? And I was like, well, funnily enough, you asked. Actually a lot. Now this is slightly not outdated. All these companies are still using GitHub, but there's more now. Now there's some pretty popular ones there. Epic Games, creator of Fortnite. We've got Riot, League of Legends. Sony, if you've heard of them. Cygames, and a personal favorite of mine, which is a Japanese gaming company that do card games and Shadowverse and things like that. So there are a lot of companies already using GitHub. Now these are, people actually actively using it. Now granted, they're not all using GitHub, however, for the source control for their video games. They might be using it for a lot of other reasons, right? Now the main problem with these things here, and the reason why these companies aren't using GitHub and Git for source control, is those problems that I mentioned haven't been solved. Now I had someone come to, this is a similar talk I gave, this is actually a second delivery of this talk, this is a bigger version of it, and he sat right in the front down here and he's like, I'm so excited about this talk, I'm going to learn all about how to fix source control in video gaming. And he got there and he's like, what do you mean it's not fixed? And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not a magician here. So a lot of these problems aren't actually solved, which is why a lot of these game companies don't use GitHub and Git to source control their games. Now I have, fortunately enough, have a lot of friends working as game developers in the gaming industry. Some of them work for Fire Monkeys and Blizzard and other EA and other kinds of things. So I said to them, I was like, so what do you do for source control in video game, these big AAA companies? Because, you're shipping out Fortnite and you're shipping out League of Legends and Starfield's gone online today. So what are you actually doing? And the two answers they come back to me with, and I kind of had a bit of a laugh out there, but the first is, source control what? I mean, I know about source controls, kind of, but what do you mean source control? We don't do source control. And I was like, what do you mean you don't do source? Is that why, Fortnite has to be taken offline all the time? Or Elder Scrolls has to have a giant big update because, you have to take the servers offline, and if something crashes, it's really hard to roll back. One thing. The second answer, a little bit, not as common, and I also see some issues with it. They use a bespoke, custom-made, in-house source control system for their video games. And I was like, okay, that's great for them, but what about the gaming industry as a whole? So if you are working at Blizzard and they have their bespoke, custom, in-house designed awesome doobie whacker thing to run source control, and then you leave Blizzard, you go to another company that also has their own custom bespoke, and the time to actually upskill in that, right, has got to be quite large. And frankly, it is, which is why game developers often stay one company for a while, or when they go to the next company, they can't actually do much for a while because they've got to learn the whole new system on how to do source control. So there's an issue there. The other issue is it doesn't really encourage a lot of people to actually get into game development because they're like, well, I'm gonna stick to software because I can do stuff on GitHub, and if I go for a job, everyone can see exactly what I've done. And also, I know how to do source control on software, so I'm just gonna stick to that. So it doesn't really encourage the expansion, I suppose, of the gaming industry and game development. And I think that's a bit of an issue because I would love more people to get into video game development and be able to build games and make games. Everyone, we've got a couple of games. Who's made a game? Yeah, great. It's fun, right? Yeah, like one of the things I love about doing web development or building a game is you actually get to see the thing happen. Like back end for me, I'm just like I don't see anything happening. How do I know my stuff works? I mean, sure, there's ways to test it, but I'm a visual person. I like seeing stuff happening. So for the people in the audience who may have done a little bit of game development, all those ones sitting there going, oh, game development does sound really fun. Like, how do I actually get into it? Like, there's not a lot of things out there, right, to be able to, obviously we have Unity and Unreal, but how do we develop and do all these things? And where do I get started? I had a few people at the last one, I really want to do this. How do I actually get started? There's a few things. Luckily, we have this great thing called open source, and there's lots of open source game engines out there for you to go and develop on. Now, yes, I mentioned we've got Unity and Unreal. They're kind of the two big main ones. Even a lot of the AAA studios use these two engines to build their games. Now, we don't often have access to be able to do that all the time, or they're clunky, or they're big, or we might be wanting to make something a bit smaller and more lightweight to start with, or we might actually want to go and maybe not build a game, but build the engine to help other people build games or be able to contribute to it, right? So what are some of the open source game engines? Here's just a few of them. Courtesy of my colleague Lee Riley, who also loves video games. Here's some game engines here. So if you're into JavaScript, there's Phaser. It's big. If you're into C++ or C#, Godot. Godot has a game engine, which is awesome. Rust, Brevity. Python, Pygame has been around for like 20-something years, so this is a great one. Godot's also a good one for Python. And then we've got some there for Go even. Go developers in the room? Go is starting to become a much bigger thing, which is cool. But there's some engines out there for you to go and try and use. And if you didn't take a photo there, that's all good. It's in the resources at the end. The other thing you can do is actually get involved in a game jam, which is like a hackathon, but you build a game. Has anyone done a game jam before? A few people? They're kind of fun, right? You get to build a game either in a limited amount of time or sometimes with constraints, and it's actually, putting constraints on things actually really, I think, great for video game. So there's a few happening right now, but one I want to talk about really briefly is Game Off. This is one that GitHub runs every year. Well, almost every year. There's one year we skipped for some reason. I can't remember what it is. I think we've run this about 14 or 15 years now. And every November, I think it's November or December, we run the GitHub Game Off. And the GitHub Game Off is a great way for you to build a game on any engine, using any platform, for any platform, any style of game, any size of game, doesn't matter how big it is, and any genre of game. There's only one catch. You have to hit the theme. So whatever the theme is for that year, you got to hit the theme. I think last year it was bug. So we had people trying to, squash bugs in games. We had people trying to, find the bugs in the code using gaming. And then some people take it completely, the other way around and, use bug as like an anagram, big unified giants or something like that, right? So GitHub Game Off is a great way to participate. And the awesome thing about this is there's actually no judging. So if you submit a game, you're a judge. So you judge all the other entries that everyone's submitted. And so there are like winners, and you are able to put this onto your resume, and you can see it on your profile, which is, I think, really, really cool. So GitHub Game Off. But there's a whole bunch of them. There's the Global Game Jam, which happens every year. JS13K Games is running right now. Has anyone heard of JS13K Games? Oh, a couple of people, perfect. So this is run by GitHub Star I think he's in Poland. I'm actually judging this year. I think I've judged it the last 3 years. But this is a really cool game, game competition, game jam, because you have to build a game in HTML5 and JavaScript, and it can't be more than 13 kilobytes. Now, I look at that and go, how the heck are you supposed to be able to do that? I just showed you all the issues at the start about, lots of files and file sizes and everything, right? And I just look at that and go, that's not really possible, right? But every single year, I am absolutely blown away by what people are able to produce in less than 13 kilobytes. And I think this is a really great exercise for coding as well. Who went to Lemon's talk yesterday? Yeah, a few people. Sweet. He was talking about, minifying things and making things more efficient, or just make something big because you can. I think something like JS13K Games, where you have this parameter put on you that you have to make something small, you go and figure out ways of compressing things, and maybe we probably don't need this. Great, and we can optimize things. Yeah, I think it really expands your mind in terms of how you can potentially do things more efficiently. And you can take some of those things that you learnt there and bring them over into software development. So that one's happening right now, and you can go into itch.io is usually the platform. Yay, platforms. Is the platform where a lot of these game jams are run. So if you head onto itch.io, you can go check them out there. The next thing we have is GitHub Game Bites. This is a brand new thing we just launched at GitHub, and it's a monthly blog written by Lee Riley. He's awesome. And what we do is we showcase a bunch of things that are happening in the game development community. So there's things on here like there's an update to one of the open source game engines. There might be a new library for one of the engines. There might be a new indie game that might have just been published. We showcase all the game jams that are coming up. So this is a great way to find out what's actually happening in the open source game industry. So that's a really cool one there, and there'll be a link to that as well. And finally, I'd actually encourage you, software developers out there, if you're interested in this stuff, to actually go and try some game development. Because, with my friend who sat in the front row before, I was like, yay, let's solve all the problems. And I'm like, sorry, there's no way to solve it. We're not going to solve these problems if we only have one type of person looking at them. So if we only have game developers looking at the game development problem and the issues with source control, I don't think we're going to solve it. I think if we have more diverse people coming together, and people from more software backgrounds, I reckon if we actually work together, we could probably solve a lot of these problems around source control and gaming. So I would encourage a lot of you to, build a game, see some of the issues that are involved, and if you have any ideas on how to solve them, let's do it. I think that would be awesome. Finally, the resources. So this is if you scan that, I will take you to a README file, which has all the things I talked about. It has the links to the blog post on the top 10 things you didn't know about GitHub projects. There's a link to the GitHub Game Bites. There's a link to some of the game jams that are happening right now. There's a whole lot of really, really great resources on there that I've put together from this talk. And because we have 10 minutes, I think we have 10 minutes, I will actually open the floor to questions, as I don't usually do. So, yeah, is there any questions from the audience? Or did I answer all your questions? Or are you sitting there going, I just want to go home and play Starfield, right now? Some of the speakers already actually queued Starfield up on their computer. They're like, as soon as I get home after this conference, straight to the computer or the Xbox, and I'm playing it. Any questions about any of the Git things or gaming or anything like that? Or you can all have an early mark. I feel like a teacher early. Oh, yeah, yep. Try and listen. Yep. How do you GIF them? Oh, how do we find the differences in them? Great question. So the question was, for when you're doing all the game development stuff and you've got your Photoshop files and images and things like that, how do you actually see the diff of those? It's really hard. It's actually quite difficult. Does anyone use GitHub Desktop here? Anyone? A couple of people? GitHub Desktop is a really great application for allowing you to see what you're actually committing to GitHub. Now, what I like about it too is for a person from a non-coding background like myself, it's a very visual tool. It's a nice big blue button that says, hey, there's some changes you might want to push. Would you like to push them? And when you commit using desktop, you can see the diff side by side. So you see the two images that you've just committed. Now, the problem with that is you're only looking at the two images. It gives you a little bit of information about the file differences in terms of like the size, maybe the type, not really the type of file because you're going to commit over it, but it shows you a couple of differences about the file type, and you can see it, the two images side by side, and if you can eyeball enough, you can go, oh yeah, there's a change there. But in the Git, there's not really anything there, because when we commit something, it has to put it all into binary, right? It has to put in ones and zeros. So it's not really that easy to go back, right? Which is, again, a problem when it comes to source control on things like assets that are not code related, right? So there's not really a great way to see a diff. Now, GitHub is starting to do some things. Has anyone ever committed a SRT file, a 3D image? Anyone ever committed some 3D images to GitHub? I would highly recommend you do that, because if you commit a 3D image to GitHub, and you can do it by downloading any kind of 3D file, and commit them, you can actually see the diff of the two 3D images on the web though. So you can't see it in a terminal, obviously. You can't see it in any other kind of UI. You have to be on the web, and you have to like literally go down, click difference, and actually visually see the two differences between those files. But again, it's not easy. So hopefully that answered a bit of your question. Awesome. Another question? We got the sound people at the back. What was that movement? I just saw hands waving. Does the sound people have questions? They're like, how do I commit all my sound to GitHub and my audio and my video? Ooh, we might be here for a while. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Awesome. Well, everyone gets a little bit of an early mark, and I have lots of stickers. So if you'd like to come up on the front, I'm going to put a bunch of stickers up the front here. And if you do have questions that you either think about later, or you're like, I didn't want to really ask in front of everyone else, feel free to message me on a social media platform. I probably should put Signal up there now, I suppose. But feel free to message me, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And thank you so much for listening to me.